Okay, Jasmine, I believe we are all set.
So, hi guys, welcome. Thank you for coming tonight and joining Brashani and I in this ever so important conversation about alternatives to incarceration. I am Jasmin Borges. I am formerly incarcerated. I am one of the creators and founders of I Am, and we're just really excited to have all of you guys here.
Great. As Jasmine said, we are I Am. This is my warrior sister, and I'm just going to tell you a little bit about what it is that we do for I Am. So our main mission statements for I Am are that we want to provide education to people around the issues of mass incarceration, specifically people who have never been impacted at all by prison. We want to establish a community of support for people who have been impacted and give them a place to come. And we want to bring together all perspectives and really work through how do we change the long systemic, like how do we change the systemic issues by working together. Okay, so if you go ahead and pull up your chat feature for me really quick as we get this started. Just want to jump off with a little bit of an interactive question for all of you. So what do you believe is the purpose of the justice system? No right or wrong answers. Just kind of want to get you guys thinking and involved as we start to think about what the alternatives to the prison system might look like. What is the purpose of the justice system? So I see, yep, punishment, labor, yep, reform, yeah, should be, yeah, we're gonna touch on that, should be rehabilitation, right? Definitely. Yep, some form of accountability, I love that. Yeah, punish to the extreme, absolutely, criminalize, enslave, and then of course, safety, reform, rehabilitation, punishment.
Right.
I'm seeing a theme. Seeing a theme of our crew tonight. Right, so those are great answers, thank you, and I appreciate everybody's honesty. Just want you to be authentic in this space, no matter what perspective you have.
Right.
So depending on what school of thought you subscribe to, the purpose of the justice system is either rehabilitation, confinement, for somebody mentioned public safety issues, right?
Yeah.
Or retribution. Here at I Am, we want to build beyond those traditional schools of thought and add a restorative justice principle, namely that of accountability and repairing of harms.
Right.
So as we move through the conversation today, the question that we want to keep in mind is which principle is being supported by a proposed action? In other words, when we refer a person to the mental health system, which purpose of the justice system are we embracing? When we detain someone, are we detaining them because it's absolutely necessary? And when we sentence someone to a lengthy prison sentence, perhaps, just perhaps, we are compromising our own humanity by embracing a tenet of retribution. Now, there are better ways in which we can embrace the concept of a justice system that is designed for accountability and what would happen if we treated detainment as the last option, not the first.
Right.
So now I'm going to turn this over to my friend and colleague, Jasmine.
Thank you so much, Brashani. Again, thank you all for being here with us tonight. I really hope that we can have an awesome conversation. I'm going to be authentic as usual. This is my experience. And with that being said, I'm going to start. Day one, moment one, the arrest, loss of your humanity, and it's only day one. The cruiser, the silence, the immediate division, plexiglass separating me, the offender, from the rest of the society, the raw, rough metal handcuffs, the fingerprinting, the mugshots, the immediate loss of property, a cell with a toilet and a camera. It's my first encounter with the loss of privacy and dignity, and it's only day one. Silence. This is at the precinct. The courthouse is another cell with a toilet in it and a camera as well. The waiting, the unknown, immediate loss of connection, and the immediate waiting till this is over and it's only day 2. Then there's the public parade known as your arraignment. You enter a plea of not guilty, but why do I already feel so guilty? Why do I feel so tried and so unheard, so non-existent in this process? Everyone and everything is so unfeeling, and the only thing I feel are the tears streaming down my face. There are more cuffs and added shackles cutting into my skin. On the way to county, you ride in a paddy wagon filled to the brim with men and women. It's dark, no seat belts. Panic sets in. How do I save myself if there's an accident? Survive no matter what, a small voice says. Survive no matter what. County jail processing. You are made to sit in a chair, go through a metal detector, and everything feels intense and fear-filled with uncertainty. There you are stripped for the first time, and not the last time. There you endure and suffer the loss of your body. You are processed again, more fingerprinting and more mugshots. But here there is a new loss, and it is the loss of your human name. And there you are given a number. You wear orange scrubs. You notice the colors are dull, but the lights are bright. There are no glass mirrors, so your reflection is distorted on stainless steel. Inside and out. Why can't I see who I am? Why can't I see my scars? Why won't you let me see the ugliness he left behind? The ugliness that isn't hidden yet in layers of scars. If I could see what I want to see. This is the first 72 hours. General population. The smells are of disinfectant and disgusting. The food is not fit for human consumption. It is loud day in and day out. Upstate, we use our fans to block out noise. In county, we use the music to do so. There is never any silence. Loud doors, keys make quietness impossible. Back to the courts. Most of us can't afford an attorney, so we're assigned public defenders. Most of us can't afford bail, so we await trial, if we're allowed bail at all. Most plead out to a lesser charge and fear that the justice system isn't really just. I'm not sure where these myths come from, that we're the land of the free and that we're just. Because when you enter the system, you didn't already know. And if you didn't already know that the system is broken, you learn real fast once you enter it. Once you're sentenced upstate. There, the atmosphere is tense. It's us versus them, us versus us. There is violence. There are deaths due to suicide and drug overdoses. And there is trauma on top of trauma on top of trauma. It is easy to get lost in the system when you're already lost. It is hard to find yourself, to find your value and worth. When you are counted and told what you can and cannot do every day at all times. Finding hope is hard. Visits with your family are harder. Watching your children grow without you is time you'll never get back. Financial hardships are real, and PIC is a very real thing. I lived this for 12 and a half years. Through all this chaos, if you are brave enough, you begin to work towards your freedom, and nothing else matters. You learn to cope and accept your situation for what it is. You learn how to move inside. My vision, my dream, my goal was focused on my freedom. Nothing else mattered. I began to heal. But there is a population that cannot work toward their freedom because we, society, have called them irreparable. They are our lifer population. They are my sisters and my brothers that we have forgotten, who have served 20, 30 years and have been told that freedom is not an option. Reentry services are just about non-existent, and inside you're lucky to leave prison with a place to live and mass health. When you do come home, you come home to nothing. You start from nothing and you go with nothing. What you really need is a community to get through this next phase they call reintegration. They call me a success story, but what many don't know is 3 nuns took a chance on me. They believed in me and showed me community. But in honesty, I am not a success story. I'm a rarity because recidivism rates are so high in our country, and the deck is stacked against us for us to fail. What I want everyone to know tonight is my story is not unique. I am not alone. 2.3 million people are incarcerated. 2.3 million brothers, fathers, sisters, mothers are incarcerated. I do not ask for sympathy. I ask only that tonight we reimagine what justice in America can actually be. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jasmine. I want to take a moment to pause here. What Jasmine just shared is profound, personal, deeply personal, and she took a risk to share it with us tonight. So I ask that we take a moment of silence in recognition of those who have had this journey and those that are still having this journey right now as we speak. Thank you again, Jasmine. Really appreciate
Thank
you.
you.
I'm going to mute you, my friend, just so I don't have the background noise, but let me know if you
Yeah,
want mute at any point, okay?
sounds good.
So we're now about to transition into a more academic discussion, but it is my hope that we can keep Jasmine's experience in mind as we move forward into this. After all, people are always attached to our decision making, and when we're talking about alternatives to incarceration, ultimately what we are talking about is hope for all of the people who are in there and all the people who may in the future unfortunately encounter our justice system. When we talk about alternatives to incarceration, we also have to talk about prevention, referred to as the front end, and reentry, referred to as the back end, in order to create alternatives and find our way out of our mass incarceration problem. We have to focus on all three. So tonight I ask that everybody keep an open mind. When we say alternatives to incarceration, we're not just talking about at the front end, we're talking about a path of redemption, a path of homecoming for everyone. The current model has 3 clearly marked separate systems, and there is minimal overlap, and this is an assembly line approach to justice. So a person who encounters the criminal justice system often has to start over again at every different juncture, as Jasmine mentioned, and any interactions that that person has had with the mental health system, like being hospitalized or addiction treatment or the medical system for like chronic pain or anything like that, they're not integrated into this system when a person goes in. Everyone in our society is working in a silo type situation. So the very first step is we have to pull apart the issues of mental health, addiction, poverty, and homelessness versus illegal, potentially dangerous, not necessarily dangerous activity, and then violence, which is its own separate issue. Our next step is to decriminalize and remove prison as the option for any of those first categorical issues. They are exacerbated by prison. There is no doubt, the research supports that. We should never be putting somebody in a prison for any of those reasons. The next step is to take that second level of illegal activity and determine What is the distinction between something that is illegal, and yeah, we'd like to address this in our community, versus something that is illegal and actually dangerous? There are many instances where you can parse those things apart. And then last but not least, we always have to talk about violence, keeping in mind custody should be a last resort. So this is one place in where our society, in order to actually change what is happening, we need to ask ourselves the question, the difference between the perception of risk versus actual risk. We've all learned about unconscious biases, especially in the light of the Black Lives Matter movement. A lot of people have been talking about it, right? Unconscious biases play a huge role. We have media portrayals of what it means to be an addict, what it means to be involved in gang violence or to have a mental illness, or even such things as sexual predators. Our fear responses as a society have kicked in out of self-preservation. And although these unconscious biases do not make us bad people, they are driving any new criminal justice legislation that happens and blocking any legislation that is attempting to dismantle incarceration in the name of safety. Remember the question that I asked at the very beginning. We should ask ourselves, will detaining this individual rehabilitate them? Do we actually need to detain them in order to keep other people safe? And then last but not least, has this person's behavior reached a level in which we are willing to compromise our morality by engaging in an act of revenge or retribution? And at the very high level, is there a way that we are serving accountability by incarcerating the person? In most instances, we would find not. So you're going to notice as I move through these slides tonight that you'll see my little evidence-based practice icon. I have a doctorate in forensic psychology, so I'm huge on evidence-based practices. Keep your eyes open as we move through the slides for this, because if it's present on the slide, it means that there is some type of evidence-based practice that could actually be utilized. And the perception of our society is that we have to have prisons because we have dangerous and violent people, and this is simply not true. If we utilized this type of flow chart structure from the very beginning, we would immediately see a drop in detainment levels. Let's touch very quickly on the subject of violence. We're actually going to do a separate webinar dedicated to that. But given that most people assume that incarceration is needed for this reason, if we change the way that we approach violence and actually use the World Health Organization public health approach to violence, we would be in much better shape as in America. So when you go after a public health issue, the first thing that you do is you collect data, lots and lots of data. Then you identify your risk and protective factors. You want to know, why does violence occur and who does it actually impact? Then you develop some interventions and see if they're effective. And then lastly, you implement what seems to be the most effective for the people that are the most impacted. If we actually looked at violence from a public health approach, we would understand that actually violence happens in hotspots, and there are not very many of them in the country. We can pretty much predict where violence is going to happen. And even though most people in our country live in fear around things like homicide, statistically speaking, the person who is most likely to commit homicide is actually also the person who's most likely to die from homicide. And those hotspots are the places that have the least amount of education, the least amount of community resources, and the least amount of employment opportunities. Through evidence-based practice, we can actually determine where the allocation of resources need to go. And I just want to speak the truth of our society right here and just say that what I'm referring to are young men of color. They are the ones who are most likely to be harmed by violence, and they are also the ones that are least likely to get the appropriate response. So instead of an assembly line approach, research supports something that is sometimes referred to as deterrence packages. So I know the chart in front of you has a lot of information. Let's just take a look at it really quickly, sort of starting over on that left-hand side. Anything that's bold and italicized is particularly handy for legal charges, right? So if somebody's facing possible criminal sanctions, these are sort of like our categories of what our options are. And then when you move over, you'll notice that it's a lot of social supports like employment and education, but then also community opportunities like volunteering and mentoring. And then sort of that last category, you know, we have a variety of mental health treatment options available, whatever fits for people. Recovery programs come in all shapes and sizes. Medical treatment is key. And then at the very bottom, I put the strategies for reducing group violence, because we actually know a lot about what's effective. We just don't implement it. So I want to make a note about this collaborative approach that we're proposing here. Many other people have proposed this type of approach in the past. The difference is that we have often had a top-down implementation of these practices. So we sort of in this like higher level, like whatever, we think we know what people need, and we sort of just come into these communities and we try to drop it on them like, oh, you just need this, without actually doing the collaboration that's required. So what we're proposing is that we need to work really hard to get the buy-in of the individual who has penetrated the system. So we picture this as like a negotiation to some extent, right? Now, I want to be very clear. We believe that this could be tailored for different circumstances and contexts. So for instance, if somebody was physically assaulted, but they were willing to drop the charges and not press charges, and we have that drop charge at that top corner happening, then it might be that we require that individual to move through some sort of conflict resolution, mediation, or restorative justice process in lieu of any sort of fines or criminal sanctions or anything like that. One of the major keys here is to not over supervise. Our criminal justice system has a tendency to put things like probation and supervision at the front end. It's like somebody like looks in the wrong direction and boom, you have a probation officer, and they want you to check in weekly. And that actually gets in the way when a person has just made a mistake, or they've had a slip or a relapse or something, and they just need to get themselves sort of back on track. So in our model, supervision would only come into play if the person was really struggling with meeting the goals of their collaborative plan, or if the person had asked for supervision because they actually find the structure of supervision to be very helpful. Some people do believe that. Okay, speaking of restorative justice practices, so why are we here tonight, right? We're here tonight because we want to talk about alternatives to incarceration, and this is such a huge topic. So I'm just going to take a minute to give a very clear example that you guys can go and look up on your own, and I highly recommend that everybody does. This organization, Common Justice, they are in Brooklyn and the Bronx in New York, and they were founded by a woman that I have the utmost respect for, named Danielle Sered. You can look her up. She's written a book called Until We Reckon. And I can drop that name in the chat for you guys sort of towards the end of this. So you'll notice here, when you look at this slide, this is not attached to the criminal justice system, right? This is an organization that sits outside of the criminal justice system. And what they focus on is that if survivors of violence are willing, first and foremost, willing to engage in an alternative rather than the criminal justice system, they will take those cases on. And for those of you who aren't familiar with restorative justice, generally speaking, the idea is that a harm has been done, and a person who has been harmed has some say in what will then sort of happen to that individual, or what they desire to have as some sort of like accountability process or restitution or something like that. And what I think is really interesting about restorative justice is that when you take the time to ask survivors what it is that they want from somebody who has done harm to them, I think most Americans would be surprised, because our image of survivors is that survivors just want revenge and retribution, and that's why we set up the system, right, in the name of survivors. Wow. But in reality, actually, like I've seen some of the plans that have come out of Common Justice, and those survivors have asked the people that have harmed them to go to school, you know, commit to getting a degree, commit to supporting their family, and essentially doing the right thing. So this is Common Justice. I urge all of you guys to look them up, and Jasmine and I will most likely be doing a restorative justice webinar where we'll do like a circle process, and we'll invite all of you to come, and we'll sort of walk through what a circle process would actually look like. I wish I had more time to talk about it tonight, but we will get on it. So moving into the context of custody. So first and foremost, prisons do not need to be prisons. If it is decided that detainment is going to occur, there is so much about what we know about what is traumatic and harmful about prison versus what is healing and how a person finds recovery. As with the front end of prevention, evidence-based practices must lead the way in this. Our current model classifies individuals by their offenses only, by their charges, what they were found guilty of or what they're accused of, and their perceived level of risk. But any forensic psychologist will tell you that an appropriate assessment of that individual requires so much more information than that. If we utilize a treatment center model as opposed to a prison, the first step we would do is we would actually engage with the person in terms of assessing their personality style, what their actual level of risk is, and their openness to treatment. And these all have approaches. I have a little asterisk by all of them. They all have approaches that have evidence-based tools for assessing in the behavioral sciences. So remember the collaborative plan approach that I'm talking about at the front end. In this situation, we would want to continue it in some fashion in custody. As much as possible, we want continuity of care. So even if a person moves from in the community into some sort of detained state, as much as possible, we would want those services and those providers to continue for that person. So given the stark reality that most incarcerated people have experienced higher levels of trauma than the rest of society, the programming and services would lead with trauma-informed care. And that helps the person start to make connections between their past traumas and their present-day behaviors. It's very clear that in this model, a key component would be that we would clearly outline the minimum of what a person needs to do in order to come home. So right now our prison is like a dark, dank, like, you know, they just get sent there and then they're just left there until some sort of like parole process becomes available or some sort of appeal. And it's literally a dark abyss of hopelessness. And in this model, we would outline clearly what the expectations of society are for this person to be able to come home. So all of us recognize the importance of our environment. And here is an example of one type of prison cell in America. There are much worse examples, I just want to note, and few that are better. So this was somewhere like kind of in the middle, although they're all pretty terrible. And then here's an example of a residence facility in Norway. So let's go back to the initial question. Which of these three justice principles, rehabilitation, confinement, or retribution, are being supported by the design of the American prison cell versus the Norwegian facility? Is it necessary for our cells to be colorless, small, rancid, and loud? Is it necessary to have multiple layers of heavy ironclad doors for containment? What are we saying about the type of justice that we're supporting when the food is inedible, lacks nutritional value, and even makes people sick? And then lastly, it's hard to capture this in a picture, but the feeling of a prison, the vibe, the energy is like a powder keg. So correctional officers have been trained to fear for their lives and to constantly be on guard from the incarcerated. Jasmine mentioned in her piece, the us versus them tribalism is constantly reinforced by the system itself and exacerbates the likelihood that violence is going to occur rather than protecting people from violence. On day one, and Jasmine and I actually, we had a conversation with a former correctional officer very recently, and he told us about how on day one of his training, they're shown a video of what it looks like when an officer is jumped by a group of incarcerated people and assaulted. Now, is this possibility, like, is this scenario a possibility? Of course. But statistically speaking, it's unlikely. And in many situations, if a fight breaks out, actually incarcerated people will protect officers who have been good to them, but that doesn't make the news. That's not something that we talk about. I think of it this way. If I was introduced to this world and I was shown a video, like right off the bat, of a man kidnapping and sexually assaulting me, you know, what I consider to be like worst case scenario of life, I am more likely to then walk through the world anticipating that scenario, and it's dangerous to my health and toxic to my well-being. And so an important component to this alternative type of custody would be that reentry and release planning would begin day one when someone enters a facility, regardless of the length of their sentence. All of the components that are listed here, like employment, housing plans, etc., would involve the outside community at an appropriate level. Similar to the models in other countries, people would be granted opportunities to work outside the facility to better prepare for their transition. And some strategies that can be immediately utilized to reduce incarceration are, like with the front end of supervision, we would actually make parole, we would flip parole on its head. So you'll notice I listed here maximum 15-year sentencing for all offenses. That's what research, again, right, evidence-based practice, right? That's what research supports is the max amount of time that somebody, you know, in order to get sort of like the benefit or whatever you want to say of being detained. Not that I agree with that, but that should be the max level of detainment. Presumptive parole is when you take the parole process and you flip it around. So instead of making it so a person has to convince a parole board that they are fit to come home, as soon as a person is parole eligible, they get to come home. And if the parole board wanted, they would have to then use an evidence-based practice to show that that person is still a risk to their community, or that they have yet to meet the minimum requirements of their collaborative treatment plan that they had inside. So as with every step of the process, we would make sure the person, if they were detained further because of parole, again, we would outline, this is exactly what you need to do in order to be released, in order to come home. Periodic review would automatically happen, and all criminal justice reform and Supreme Court decisions would automatically be retroactive. So for those of you who aren't familiar, when Miller v. Alabama happened in 2012, which made it unconstitutional to automatically sentence a juvenile to life without parole, there were several states that basically said, okay, fine, from this day forward, we won't, but we're not gonna look at our 2000 juveniles that we, you know, juvenile lifers that we have. We're just gonna wait until the Supreme Court clarifies, and those individuals end up waiting another 3 years before they got an opportunity to come home. So we would not do that. So about the back end, really, I only have two things to say about the back end, and that is refer to the front end. And this should have been going all the way from start to finish as much as possible. So whatever somebody's employment is, occupation is, whatever, you know, housing situation, like whatever community they live in, if they have family therapy, if they have reintegration therapy, if they do mentoring or volunteering, to the extent that is completely, you know, possible and workable in a situation, those things should continue from start to finish, regardless of whether or not someone is detained for a lengthy amount of time or not. And no one should ever be placed back in incarceration because of a technical violation of their parole conditions. So for those of you who aren't familiar with parole, and this will be another webinar that Jasmine and I are going to tackle, is violence and parole sort of coupled together with extreme sentencing. A technical violation means that a person has, for instance, started using substances. Maybe they've relapsed, on their addiction. And then they just get picked up, scooped up, and sent back to prison on a technical violation, whether or not they were ever in danger of hurting another person or anything like that. And so see my prior comment about over supervising, because that's not helpful for a person to live under that type of scrutiny. And actually in Massachusetts, for those of you who are here in our wonderful state, you can actually send somebody back if you suspect that they might have a technical violation at some point, which is a lot of power to put in one person's hands. At the end of all of this, like I said, I'm an evidence-based practitioner. This is how I roll. So I would ask that we reassess how success is measured in our systems. If you are at your job and the only way your manager measures your success is by you not failing at a bunch of things, I guarantee you that you will find it hard to know whether or not you are actually succeeding at anything, and you will most likely find your work to be very unfulfilling. Currently, we measure success, by these types of standards, right? The number of people who enter or leave a facility, the number of people who get off probation successfully, or if you didn't fail a urine test, good for you. So what happens if we actually measure by education completed, and that could be a training course or a job or anything like that, when a person is able to maintain consistent employment, and when a person has been participating in mentoring or some sort of volunteering or giving back to the community. So that about wraps it up. Here's our contact information before we jump into the Q&A, if you just want to take note of it. I just want to say this is a massive topic, and Jasmine and I will most likely have either a part 2 to this conversation where we dig deeper into restorative justice practices. And also, I have a ton of programs that have been implemented in other cities that can give us sort of the numbers, the breakdown in terms of this much money is saved, by not incarcerating people, and this many people were not incarcerated because they went through this program instead. And there's just a lot of success out there, so I want us all to remain hopeful and optimistic. Excuse me. So I'm going to stop sharing so that we can, and I'm also going to stop recording. There we go.